Battlefield is a storied franchise that has produced unforgettable games like Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 1, though it is also a series that has stumbled in recent years due to its developers' questionable design choices, arrogant obstinacy, and their dismissive disdain for their fans' feedback. The issues ultimately culminated in the disappointing commercial performance of Battlefield 5, a game that was so deeply troubled that the developers were unable to revitalize it during the 1.5 years after its release. After Battlefield 5 was ultimately abandoned in June 2020, fans of the franchise looked to DICE's next title, Battlefield 2042, to get the series back on track. After playing for 4 days, though, it feels like 2042 is gearing up to be an even bigger disappointment than Battlefield 5, and this video will explain why. So if you like content like this, please like, subscribe, press the bell and select all notifications, and follow us on Twitter too while you're at it. Now some might say, you've only played the beta. The developers said it was an old build. They say they've fixed many of the issues, so the beta is not representative of the final product. Developers always say that, don't they? Yet when has that ever been the case, for any game? Battlefield betas have always been a preview of launch stability, or rather, launch instability. For over a decade now, betas have been held far too close to launch to allow any time for the developers to fix issues identified in the beta. For instance, the Battlefield 4 beta was an unforgettable disaster, and its launch was an even bigger catastrophe. It would seem DICE has forgotten, but the community certainly shouldn't. Pre-launch demo would be a more accurate title for what these trials are, though it is understandable why developers wouldn't want to describe buggy experiences as a demonstration of what their work will turn out to be. Age of Empires 4 was refreshingly honest with the title of its pre-release trial, Technical Stress Test. Sadly, DICE stuck to calling their event beta, though they haven't used it accurately for over a decade now. Historically, DICE betas have always been representative of the game's art style, and Battlefield is or was a series renowned for its visionary graphics, though closer examination suggests DICE followed an innovate-iterate cycle, kind of like Intel's abandoned TikTok plan. Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 5 built on the breakthroughs of their predecessors, Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 1 respectively, which are so visually exquisite that they even give games released today a run for their money. Battlefield 2042 is an embarrassment to that legacy, as it looks worse than its predecessors its developers launched 3 or even 5 years earlier. At best, Battlefield 2042 looks like an expansion for Battlefield 4, but it sure doesn't perform like it. Battlefield 2042 runs at a half the frame rate of Battlefield 4 and even Battlefield 1, despite the fact it doesn't look any better. This failure is inexplicable. The better a game looks, the more complex it tends to be. The more complex a scene is, the longer it takes to render each frame, thus the fewer frames you see every second. Ideally, you want to minimize complexity while retaining visual detail, which Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 3 achieve spectacularly. Battlefield 2042 has done the opposite, presenting dated visuals with disappointing performance. Seriously, where is all the processing power going? The textures are mediocre, the lighting is dull, the character models are laughably bad, and yet the game performs so poorly. This is not to mention the technical issues, like the user interface displaying the same name twice upon killing an enemy, the UI misidentifying a corpse as a living enemy, glitches like the visual flickering and a distracting X persisting on the crosshairs, and broken functionality like the flares on jets failing to divert incoming missiles, leading to unfair deaths and unnecessary ejections, inability to spawn into available vehicles or on teammates, or the camera on vehicle gunners jerking uncontrollably, falling below the map, or the useless AI bots being completely passive or even stationary sitting ducks. Some might say this was just a beta. So were the Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5 betas, when they looked much better than Battlefield 2042. Historically, Battlefield betas have been representative of the game's visuals, if not performance, which does not bode well for Battlefield 2042. Honestly, Battlefield 5 looked rather good at the end of its life cycle. The maps released post-launch were remarkably vibrant and detailed. It's a pity then that the game only rendered the detail when you're a few feet away. The pop-in is one of the biggest blemishes burdening Battlefield 5. All Battlefield 2042 had to do was increase the draw distance or at least provide a slider that players with powerful PCs could max out, or at least experiment with. Instead, DICE looked to have discarded everything they accomplished over the last 5 years. And some might say visuals don't matter, gameplay does. Funny how they don't care about graphics only when the game's ugly. While the technical issues in these betas may eventually be ironed out, it might take months or even years after release, as was the case with Battlefield 4. The abandonment of Battlefield 5 indicates that EA is no longer inclined to commit to funding long-term revitalization of games that have struggled at launch, and this does not bode well for Battlefield 2042. While betas might not be representative of what the game will be like at the end of its development cycle years after launch, these pre-launch previews do demonstrate the fundamental design of the game, and Battlefield 2042's beta has demonstrated that it is fundamentally flawed. For a start, you can no longer do most of the things that have come to define Battlefield over the last decade. Squad cooperation is all but dead. You can forget about receiving ammunition or health regeneration from your team. Why would they equip ammo boxes when they could instead choose rocket launchers or anti-air missiles? Battlefield's signature classes have been entirely removed and replaced by specialist characters who can equip any gun in the game. This is an extension of trends started by Battlefield 4, which let any class equip a designated marksman's rifle or carbine. Spotting enemies is much more restrictive, which makes attacking infantry from helicopters very finicky. It is almost impossible to spot enemies from any significant distance, as Battlefield 2042 literally does not render player models unless it decides you are close enough, and that can be a very short distance indeed. This makes flying helicopters a terrible experience, since your view will be cluttered with debris that the game determines is more important to render until you're right on top of your target, and even then, your rockets will take several seconds to reach your target, by which time they will have moved on. The attack helicopter feels particularly terrible to play due to its rockets that are slow to fly and even slower to reload, since each round is reloaded individually. Heck, even the light helicopter feels stronger, even though it's equipped with smaller rockets, since these rockets fire faster, fly faster, and reload faster. I'm not saying this because I struggled with the game. I did well enough with all the vehicles and weapons I used. No matter how well I did, though, I never had any fun, and I suspect my failure to enjoy the game is due to the terrible feedback. Why is it so bad? Because the user interface is a nightmare. Killing an enemy does not result in a satisfying audio-visual notification, but rather a confusing mess of text and symbols that presents crucial information in the most inconvenient and unintuitive ways. Why is the XP counter on the far right where it's obscured by controls and key prompts? Why is it so hard to distinguish when you got a kill or merely an assist? Why is it so hard to find the objectives? Why is it so hard to tell me if I'm capturing the objective? Why is it so hard to tell when enemies are capturing what objective? Because the font is too thin, and so are the rings that surround it. Why is it impossible to discern what settings the game is using? Because the game inverts the colors of the on-off buttons when you select a setting. Good luck identifying if you just turn that option on or off. These are basic UI design rules which have been perfected over thousands of games during the past 5 decades. It's not excusable for a publisher like EA, a developer like DICE, and a franchise like Battlefield to get the basic requirements so wrong. Especially for the 15th Battlefield game? And that's not counting expansions. You want to know why this happens? Because places like EA and DICE are not the publisher-developer creative powerhouses we are led to believe. They're the sweatshop of the gaming industry. It's where young and upstart game developers go to cut their teeth, gain experience, minimum wage, long hours, churn and burn. And don't get me started on the complete lack of imagination and vision these young upstarts have, fresh out of their neutered free-thinking colleges and higher educations. Dare not have a free thought for fear of being cancelled, so they conform to safe, uninspired, cookie-cutter ideals, fearful of true innovation and expression, and that's reflected in their triple-ass titles they produce. Sorry, I'm getting off track. These are problems Battlefield 2042 cannot afford to have, and yet DICE caused this by experimenting unnecessarily with their UI. Battlefield 2042 was supposed to be the franchise's redemption after its disastrous predecessor, but it's looking like the final nail in Battlefield's coffin. Some might look to DICE LA, now renamed as Ripple Effect, to rescue Battlefield 2042 post-launch like they did with Battlefield 4. But they've been working on 2042 from the get-go, and yet the game turned out to be a disappointing, bland mess, without any charm, identity, or reason to exist. Seriously, why does Battlefield 2042 even exist? Obviously, to continue the Battlefield franchise and generate revenue for EA. That's not the question, though. What does Battlefield 2042 do for the franchise and its fans? Nothing. Except perhaps port the maps of previous better Battlefields to the new engine, which has so far looked and performed worse than the aforementioned predecessors. To understand how unnecessary Battlefield 2042 is, let's compare its purpose, or lack thereof, to its predecessors and what they did for the series over the last decade. Bad Company 2 brought Battlefield's spin-off series to PC, featuring intense infantry action on compact yet completely destructible maps. Battlefield 3 was a massive leap in visual fidelity despite launching only a year after Battlefield. Bad Company 2. Battlefield 3 was a step down in destructibility, though it compensated by featuring much larger maps and greater vehicle variety, particularly with its expansions. Battlefield 4 did not bring as many innovations as Battlefield 3, except perhaps Levolution, though this limited, scripted destruction event kind of felt like a gimmick that DICE shoehorned into Battlefield 4 to differentiate it from its predecessor. The most memorable difference was Battlefield 4's disastrous launch, though the game did recover from this thanks to DICE LA's committed support in the years following its release, due to which Battlefield 4 is now considered to be the most polished game of the series. The next game in the series, Hardline, wasn't quite as lucky, as it was an ill-conceived modification of Battlefield 4 EA saddled Visceral with. The studio was tasked with changing the factions to cops and criminals, which did not fit the gameplay the Battlefield franchise was known for. Predictably, it turned out to be a disappointment that doomed its developer to closure. Thankfully, the franchise survived this stumble since its successor was an absolute banger. Battlefield 1 was the boldest game the series ever took, and it paid off spectacularly. One of the very few games set in the First World War, Battlefield 1 was unlike any Battlefield before it, featuring weapons and vehicles never before seen in the Battlefield franchise, or in any other competing franchise. Battlefield 1 also brought a massive upgrade in graphics compared to its predecessors, featuring incredible lighting, textures and particle effects that hold up so well, even 5 years later, that they look better than most games released in 2021. DICE coupled this visual splendor with audio design and music that gave Battlefield 1 a strong identity that distinguishes it, and in my opinion, elevates it above its predecessors and competitors. Battlefield 5 was supposed to be the franchise's glorious return to its roots. The long-awaited Battlefield set in the Second World War. Fans of the franchise were eagerly anticipating what a World War II Battlefield would look like in 2018, given DICE's groundbreaking advancements in graphics and sound design. I hoped Battlefield 5 would be to World War II what Battlefield 1 was for World War I, but that was not to be. DICE dropped the ball, hard. First by releasing a reveal trailer that deflated all the hype and replaced the anticipation with confusion, disappointment and uncertainty over the game's authenticity, or lack thereof. DICE then proceeded to shoot themselves in the other foot by doubling down on their questionable character design, then by daring disappointed fans to boycott the game, which they did. This was a blow Battlefield 5 never recovered from. The game did receive some additional content post-launch, the most significant of which were the maps set in the Pacific Theatre of World War II. However, these DLCs failed to rescue Battlefield 5 after its troubled launch, leading DICE to abandon the game in June 2020. This is what Battlefield 2042 has to make up for, but instead it's looking to be even more troubled than what Battlefield 5 was. What exactly does Battlefield 2042 do for the franchise? What does it bring to the table that its predecessors didn't? What sets it apart from other Battlefields? It's not set in a seldom featured setting like Battlefield 1 was. It's not a modern return to the series' World War II roots like Battlefield 5 was supposed to be. It's not a visual breakthrough like Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 1 were. In fact, it's a technical downgrade from its predecessors both in graphics and performance. What does it offer to compensate? A unique setting? Nope. Its near-futuristic setting is nigh indistinguishable from most of the weapons and vehicles in Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4. An extensive single-player campaign? Definitely a nope. Battlefield 2042 does nothing that is not already done better in older Battlefields, which can be had for much cheaper owing to their age. Battlefield 2042 will be better off as a new expansion pass for Battlefield 4. It would perform better too if it had used that polished engine, but obviously EA would never allow that to happen. Since the release of the lackluster Battlefield 5 and its eventual abandonment by EA and DICE, all I wanted was for EA to start supporting Battlefield 4 again, clean up the servers, update its anti-cheat, and let us all enjoy ourselves. But why do that when EA can make money from gamers with Battlefield 2042? Battlefield 2042 is not the return to form fans of the franchise were hoping for. It is a bland, broken, soulless corporate turd. A disgrace to a series that once stood for something. If EA is still the ruthless corporate taskmaster, known and hated for its intolerance of its subsidiaries' stumbles, DICE may not be long for this world. But given their attitude in recent years, would that be such a bad thing?